Nigeria stands firm against U.S. pressure to accept Venezuelan deportees, a critical analysis of diplomatic tensions. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa speaks and the world listens. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today we uncover the story behind Nigeria's firm rejection of U.S. pressure to accept deported Venezuelans, including prisoners. Why did Nigeria say no? How did the U.S. respond? And what lessons can African leaders learn from this high-stakes standoff? Stay with us as we unpack the facts, compare Africa-wide experiences, and chart a forward-looking path for the continent. Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuggar revealed this week that the United States has been exerting sustained pressure on Nigeria and other African nations to accept deported Venezuelans, some reportedly straight from U.S. prisons. In an interview on Channels Television's Politics Today, July 10, 2025, Tuggar stated that Nigeria finds this request difficult and unfair, emphasizing that the U.S. measures, tariffs, visa restrictions, and exclusion from high-level meetings are likely linked to Nigeria's refusal to comply rather than the often cited BRICS alignment. This development reflects an increasingly transactional and coercive diplomatic posture by Washington towards African states, raising profound questions about sovereignty, reciprocity, and the ethics of burden-shifting migration policies. The context: U.S.-Nigeria relations under strain. Relations between the U.S. and Nigeria have historically oscillated between strategic partnership and tense pragmatism. Nigeria is the largest economy and most populous country in Africa, a critical oil supplier, and a regional power. However, recent events suggest that Washington is recalibrating its approach under President Donald Trump's administration, prioritizing immediate domestic concerns over long-term engagement. According to Tuggar, the Trump administration requested that Nigeria and others accept Venezuelans deported from U.S. prisons. When Nigeria declined, the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on Nigerian exports, reduced visa durations for Nigerians from 5 years to 90 days, and excluded President Bola Tinubu from a meeting with 5 West African presidents: Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal, at the White House. Channels TV, 2025. This chain of punitive measures contrasts with U.S. rhetoric about partnerships with Africa, exposing an imbalance of power and a lack of respect for African agency in international diplomacy. Critical analysis: what is at stake? 1. Sovereignty and ethical responsibility. Nigeria's rejection of Venezuelan deportees is grounded in both principle and practicality. Accepting foreign prisoners would burden an already overstretched security and correctional system, create potential public safety and reputational risks, undermine sovereignty by succumbing to external coercion. As Tuggar rightly noted, we already have 230 million people. We cannot accept Venezuelan deportees to Nigeria for crying out loud. Channels TV, 2025. Similar sentiments have been echoed across Africa when Western nations attempted to outsource migration and refugee responsibilities. Libya, Tunisia, and Rwanda have faced public backlash for hosting European-bound migrants on behalf of the EU, often under opaque agreements. Amnesty International, 2023. Second, geopolitical pressure and the BRICS factor. Although much of the media framed the U.S. actions as retaliation for Nigeria's participation in the BRICS summit in Brazil, Tuggar clarified that the deportee issue was the real driver. Nonetheless, the overlap is significant. Both incidents signal Washington's discomfort with African nations asserting independent foreign policy choices, whether aligning with BRICS or rejecting burdensome migration deals. This pattern is not unique to Nigeria. South Africa faced U.S. diplomatic pressure after deepening ties with Russia and China, The Economist, 2024. Similarly, Kenya endured threats of aid withdrawal when it sought closer trade ties with China over Washington's preferred partners. 3. Visa reciprocity and narratives of fairness. On visas, the U.S. justified reducing Nigerian visas to 90 days, citing reciprocity. Yet, as Tuggar pointed out, Nigeria still grants Americans 5-year multiple entry visas. The Nigerian government introduced 90-day e-visas for tourists and business travelers to simplify procedures, not as retaliation. Nigerian Presidency, 2025. The U.S. claim of reciprocity appears disingenuous, highlighting how powerful countries may selectively reinterpret rules when convenient. Africa-wide comparison, a continent under pressure. Nigeria's predicament echoes experiences across Africa. Tunisia resisted EU demands to host African migrants turned back from Europe, calling such agreements neo-colonial. Al Jazeera, 2024. Rwanda controversially accepted UK asylum seekers under a highly criticized agreement, sparking domestic and international outcry. BBC, 2024. Libya became an EU-backed holding ground for migrants amid reports of human rights abuses in detention camps. UNHCR, 2023. Ethiopia and Sudan, under economic duress, have been pressured to serve as buffers for Europe-bound migrants in exchange for aid. These cases reveal a troubling trend. African states are often cornered into serving as dumping grounds for unwanted migrants, undermining their sovereignty, overburdening their infrastructure, and sparking political tensions. Forward-looking approach. What can be done? Strengthen African unity on migration. African states must develop a collective position on migration issues, akin to the African Union's Common African Position on Migration and Development, to resist external pressure more effectively. Coordinated diplomacy can prevent divide and rule tactics, where some states comply in exchange for favors while others bear the fallout. Diversify diplomatic and economic partners. Nigeria's engagement with BRICS is a rational move to diversify partnerships and reduce dependency on traditional Western allies. Expanding ties with the global South, including Latin America and Asia, can enhance bargaining power. Reform domestic systems. To avoid being exploited as a dumping ground, African nations should invest in robust border management, security infrastructure, and transparent migration policies that align with national interests and human rights. Demand accountability. African governments should insist on transparency and mutual respect in all bilateral and multilateral engagements. If the U.S. claims reciprocity, it must demonstrate it fairly. Latest developments. As of July 12, 2025, Nigeria's Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced ongoing talks with the U.S. to resolve the visa dispute while maintaining its stance against accepting Venezuelan deportees. The African Union has called for an emergency meeting to address the broader implications of such coercive agreements on the continent. Civil society organizations in Nigeria and beyond are mobilizing public opinion against what they term migrant colonialism, urging governments to prioritize citizens' welfare over appeasing powerful countries. The role of civil society and the diaspora, voices of resistance. One of the most significant counterweights to government compliance with coercive international demands has been the mobilization of civil society and diaspora communities. In Nigeria and across Africa, NGOs, journalists, academics, and ordinary citizens have played critical roles in holding governments accountable when sovereignty and citizens' welfare are at stake. Case study: Civil society influence. In Tunisia, after the government entered into a migrant management deal with the EU, widespread protests organized by human rights organizations forced the government to suspend key aspects of the agreement. Al Jazeera, 2024. In Rwanda, activists exposed human rights risks in the UK asylum seeker deal, leading to legal challenges in both Kigali and London. BBC 2024. In Nigeria, organizations like the Socio-Economic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP, and diaspora forums have already begun petitioning President Tinubu's administration to reject any agreement that allows Venezuelan prisoners to be deported to Nigeria. The Nigerian diaspora, estimated at over 15 million globally, has proven influential in shaping narratives, fundraising for advocacy, and lobbying foreign governments to respect African sovereignty. For example, the Nigerian American community's engagement with U.S. legislators helped counter visa restrictions imposed in 2020 on certain African nations under the Trump administration. Lessons for Nigeria: institutionalize public consultation on foreign policy decisions that directly affect citizens, leverage the diaspora as a diplomatic asset to advocate for Nigeria's position internationally, strengthen press freedom to ensure transparency in any negotiations. Case studies: successful resistance to coercive deals beyond Nigeria. Several African states have demonstrated that coordinated resistance can yield positive outcomes. 1. South Africa, BRICS and independent foreign policy. Despite U.S. threats of sanctions over its relations with Russia and BRICS, South Africa maintained its non-aligned stance and successfully hosted the BRICS summit in 2023. By communicating its strategic priorities clearly and building a coalition within the African Union, Pretoria minimized the fallout. 2. Kenya, rejecting U.S. base expansion. In 2021, Kenya rejected a U.S. proposal to expand its military base in Lamu without sufficient safeguards for local communities. Public outcry and media pressure contributed to the government's decision to negotiate better terms that prioritize Kenyan interests. 3. Botswana, diamond revenue negotiations. Botswana renegotiated its decades-long diamond agreement with De Beers in 2023, demanding and securing a larger share of revenues. This demonstrated that even small states can assert their economic interests against powerful corporations or nations. These examples highlight that sovereignty is not merely about rejecting demands, but negotiating from a position of informed strength and unity. Long-term economic and security risks. If Nigeria complies, accepting Venezuelan deportees, especially ex-prisoners, carries serious potential consequences. Security threats. An influx of foreign convicts could exacerbate already high crime rates and overburden correctional facilities. Economic strain. Caring for and monitoring deportees would require resources better spent on Nigeria's own struggling healthcare, education, and security sectors. Diplomatic precedent. Compliance may embolden future coercive demands, diminishing Nigeria's ability to defend its interests. Tuggar aptly warned that acquiescing might only mark the beginning of a lasting pattern of unfair expectations. Channels TV, 2025. Toward a new African diplomacy, principles for the future. The recent spat with the U.S. provides a teachable moment, not just for Nigeria, but for all of Africa. A forward-looking African diplomacy could rest on three principles. 1. Strategic autonomy. African states must define their priorities without undue influence, maintaining non-alignment where it benefits them. 2. Collective bargaining. Strengthen continental platforms like the African Union to negotiate as a bloc on migration, trade, and security. Mundram. Reciprocal partnerships. Demand fairness and transparency in engagements, rejecting double standards while respecting international norms. In this regard, Nigeria's firm stance, as articulated by Tuggar, signals an important, albeit overdue, recalibration of African diplomacy. If sustained and coordinated across the continent, it could help reposition Africa as an equal partner rather than a passive recipient of external dictates. Latest developments and outlook. Since the publication of Tuggar's remarks, the U.S. State Department issued a statement acknowledging ongoing discussions with Nigeria, but insisted that all nations have a shared responsibility to manage global migration. U.S. State Department, July 11, 2025. The African Union Commission chairperson, Musa Faki Mahamat, called on African states to resist external pressure to accept deportees outside established international frameworks. Nigerian civil society coalitions have announced plans for a nationwide Sovereignty First campaign to raise public awareness about the risks of accepting such deportees. Looking ahead, the coming months will test Nigeria's resolve and its ability to maintain a principled yet pragmatic diplomatic path. Historical patterns of coercion in U.S.-Africa relations. To fully understand the current dispute between Nigeria and the U.S., it is useful to situate it within the broader history of U.S.-Africa relations, which have often been marked by asymmetry, coercion, and transactionalism. Cold War legacy. During the Cold War, U.S. foreign policy in Africa prioritized containing Soviet influence, often at the expense of supporting democratic governance or development. Washington supported authoritarian regimes in Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, Liberia, Samuel Doe, and elsewhere, as long as they aligned with U.S. geopolitical interests. African sovereignty was routinely subordinated to superpower rivalries. Post-Cold War realignment. In the 1990s and early 2000s, U.S. engagement shifted toward economic liberalization, counterterrorism, and humanitarian interventions. Initiatives like PEPFAR, HIV/AIDS relief, and AGOA, trade preferences, deepened ties, but conditionality remained. Aid and access to U.S. markets were often contingent on policy compliance, contemporary era, migration, and China factor. In the past decade, two trends have shaped U.S.-Africa relations. Migration management, the U.S. and EU have increasingly sought to externalize their migration challenges by pressuring African countries to accept deportees, host asylum seekers, and strengthen borders, not always with adequate support or consultation. China's rise. As African states diversify their partners, U.S. policymakers have become more assertive, sometimes punitive, in discouraging closer ties to China, and more recently, BRICS. The Nigerian case illustrates how these dynamics continue. Washington appears to be using tariffs, visa restrictions, and diplomatic snubs to force compliance on migration issues and discourage alternative partnerships. Turning friction into leverage, opportunities for Africa. Rather than viewing the current impasse solely as a threat, Nigeria, and Africa more broadly, can use it as an opportunity to assert agency and advance national and continental interests. Leverage global competition. With the US, China, EU, Russia, India, and BRICS all vying for influence, African states can negotiate better terms by playing these powers against each other diplomatically, without becoming pawns. Reframe migration as a development issue. Rather than accepting coercive agreements, African states can advocate for partnerships that address root causes of migration: poverty, conflict, and weak institutions. This would entail demanding more investment in job creation and capacity building at home. Strengthen regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, and AU frameworks provide platforms to negotiate with global powers collectively rather than individually, reducing vulnerability to pressure. Invest in homegrown capacities. Developing robust legal, institutional, and infrastructural capacity to manage borders, protect migrants' rights, and engage in informed negotiations can reduce susceptibility to external dictates. Advice to African leaders rising to the challenge. The unfolding diplomatic row between Nigeria and the United States is more than a bilateral dispute. It is a test case for African leadership, vision, and unity. This episode underscores the urgent need for Africa's political class to rise above narrow transactional calculations and embrace statesmanship rooted in dignity, sovereignty, and foresight. Here are some actionable lessons and advice for African leaders drawn from this situation. 1. Stand firm, but engage constructively. African leaders should not shy away from standing firm when national or continental interests are at stake. However, firmness must be paired with constructive engagement. As Nigeria is doing, through ongoing dialogue with Washington, diplomacy should remain the preferred path, backed by clear principles. 2. Build domestic consensus. When foreign policy decisions have far reaching implications for citizens, transparency and inclusiveness are critical. Leaders must consult legislatures, civil society, and the diaspora to build legitimacy for their positions on contentious issues like migration and trade. 3. Invest in policy capacity. Weak policy capacity often leaves African states reactive and vulnerable to external pressures. Governments must prioritize building robust research, negotiation, and strategic planning units within their foreign ministries and presidential offices. Harness the power of regionalism. No single African country, not even Nigeria, can withstand global pressures alone. Working through regional blocs like ECOWAS and the AU strengthens Africa's bargaining power, creating a collective shield against unfair demands. 5. Practice true reciprocity. Reciprocity should be genuine, not symbolic. If African states grant 5-year visas to Americans, as Nigeria does, they have every right to demand the same. Leaders must negotiate from a position of equality, not subservience. 6. Define migration as development. Rather than accepting external definitions of migration as a problem to be contained, African leaders should frame it as part of their development strategy, focusing on creating jobs and opportunities at home to reduce involuntary emigration. Summary of key messages. Nigeria's refusal to accept Venezuelan deportees, particularly prisoners, reflects a justifiable assertion of sovereignty, security, and dignity. U.S. retaliatory measures, tariffs, visa restrictions, and diplomatic snubs highlight persistent asymmetries in U.S.-Africa relations. Similar coercive tactics are employed by Europe and the U.S. across the continent, as seen in Tunisia, Rwanda, Libya, and Kenya. African nations must learn from past experiences and assert their interests through unity, transparency, and strategic engagement. The current friction offers an opportunity for Africa to redefine its partnerships, moving toward truly reciprocal, equitable, and development-centered international relations. Final thought. The African proverb reminds us, until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. It is time for Africa's lions, its leaders and its people, to tell their own story, to define their place in the world, and to reject narratives and policies that undermine their sovereignty. The situation with the U.S. is not just Nigeria's fight. It is emblematic of a broader struggle for African dignity and agency in global affairs. The path forward demands vision, courage, and unity, qualities that Africa has in abundance if only its leaders are willing to rise to the moment. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where we tell Africa's story with courage and clarity. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, share, and comment below with your thoughts on how Africa should handle such pressures. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a critical story about Africa's place in the world. Until next time, Africa speaks and the world listens.